Hi, how do you do, you folks? Well, I'm here to teach you, so hopefully you can do some learning. And today our topic is going to be the necessary and proper clause and the implied powers. A couple things we're going to look at real quickly, hopefully 10 minutes or less, is what the necessary, we're going to look at what the necessary and proper clause is, where it is found in the Constitution, how the Constitution is interpreted, and exactly what necessary and proper means in our Constitution. And also, we're going to look at what the Supreme Court has had to say on on the necessary and proper clause, and a little bit about the expansion of the federal government's power over time. Brief talk on that. So, hey, Jack, we're here. Let's do some learning. All right, first thing we're going to look at is and we're going to answer the question, what is the necessary and proper clause? Something we talked about, hopefully you've learned about in class if you're up to this point in your study of American government or civics. But let's talk about what it is. What is the necessary and proper clause? Basically, it's found at the end of Article 1, Section 8. We've talked about the delegated powers at this point. Hopefully you have too, if you're, again, getting to this point, so you understand what the delegated powers are, or the enumerated powers, those powers that are listed in the Constitution and given to Congress directly by the Constitution. Simply stated, the necessary and proper clause is the part of the Constitution that allows the national government to expand its powers, and it creates the implied power. Basically, it implies or states that the Congress and the national government should have any power, they can make all laws that are quote-unquote necessary and proper to carry out the delegated powers, or the powers listed in the Constitution up to that point. So the powers like, some of the powers like the power to declare war, the power to coin money, the power to tax, power to regulate interstate commerce, and on, postal office, patents, copyrights, all those things. Okay, so basically the necessary and proper clause states that they have the power to do anything that they need to in order to enforce those laws that are listed in the Constitution. So what we're going to look at here in a minute is how far the government should be able to go, and I'm going to try and keep all opinion out of it and present both sides of that. But basically we're going to look at the definition of necessary and proper. An example of it, the implied powers, and it's something that comes from the necessary and proper clause. Let's just take a random power, the power to coin money, let's say. Okay, so that's stated, that's delegated by the Constitution, given to Congress. So something you should think about that the Constitution implies is whether or not, or what power that gives them. Can Congress just coin money out of thin air? Probably not, right, if you think about it. So what the necessary and proper clause does then is it allows them to create a place, like a mint or something along those lines, a place to coin money. It allows them to hire people to make that money. And then, so that's an implied power. Another example would be the postal power of Congress. You can't really have a postal service unless you have a way of transporting the mail. So they created ways it allows them to create the way that they transport mail. So those are a couple examples right there. Just keep it short and sweet and move on from there. Let's move on. Let's talk about what the definition of necessary and proper is. Alright, so now let's move on and define what the heck that term necessary and proper means. Basically, we're going to look at where the heck that line is drawn for the federal government. When does the federal government's power stop, and where does it stop, and where does the state's powers, and where's the line at for them on top of that? And we'll see over time in a discussion right in class is how that's changed over time and the expansion and growth of the federal government and how that's taken place over time. So in order to define what is necessary and proper, you have to know something about the Constitution, number one, which hopefully you do now that you've read a good chunk of it if you're in my class. And if you haven't, I would highly recommend that you do so. But basically, how you think of the Constitution should be interpreted is how you determine whether the federal government's powers are too large, too small, and whether or not they should grow any further than they already are. It's generally accepted that they have grown over time, and the government has grown over time. And there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. The federal government's powers have grown over time, and that's taken place because of this necessary and proper clause, which we're discussing right now. But basically, there are two different interpretations, two different ways of viewing the Constitution. And obviously, that you've got different areas in the spectrum. But in general, there are two different things. And on the EOC and on my test, and you've already had this if you're in my class on the test already, the term strict and liberal construction. Strict constructionism and liberal constructionism. Let's start with explaining what that means, strict constructionism. If you're a strict constructionist, you're also known as a conservative. Again, there are varying degrees of these things. And most Republicans tend to be strict constructionists, tend to be conservatives. And that simply means that you believe the federal government should only be able to do exactly what the Constitution states. So basically, those 27 delegated powers that are given to Congress should be the only thing that Congress can do if you're a strict constructionist or a conservative. So you've got that side of it. On the other side, you have the liberal constructionists, and obviously those are liberals, people who are known as having a liberal point of view. And Democrats tend to lean that direction, tend to be more liberal, again, on that spectrum. Some people are more liberal than others. But basically, they see the Constitution as this thing called a living document. Democrats believe that it should be interpreted, and it was written in a way that it was written in order to give it basically it was written in a way that so that it could evolve over time to meet the needs of the people and society as things changed. When we go through the Constitution, when you read through that Constitution, you see it's very vague and it's very short. So what liberal constructionists believe, and liberals, people who are more liberal believe, is that the Constitution should be not so much changed, but viewed in a way that it can meet the needs of the people without having to change it all the time. That's part of the reason that we have this Constitution. A lot of people believe that has lasted. It's the oldest Constitution in the world. So basically it's that way because it was so vague that it's allowed for us to change the laws without having to change the entire government, the entire Constitution. So those are the two ways of viewing the Constitution. And based on those viewpoints, that's how you can determine what the definition of necessary and proper is. And we'll talk about that real quickly here with a brief discussion of McCulloch versus Maryland Supreme Court case. So let's move on to that. The power of the federal government has expanded over time, and it's all because of that necessary and proper clause and the implied powers and the interpretation of the Constitution and how things have changed in the country and how the Constitution has been there to meet the needs of the people. So what we need to really look at then is what does the Supreme Court have to say on the that's what they do. That's their job, is to interpret the Constitution. So what do they have to say about it? So what is necessary and proper according to the Supreme Court? And they stepped in 1816 in a controversy about the bank, the National Bank, creating and rechartering a national bank. There had already been one, and the charter had run out. Basically, the charter means that it was created by Congress for that certain amount of time, and then that charter ended, so then the bank basically ceased to exist. So then this became a big issue again in Congress and in the government. So basically what happened in that court case to begin took place in 1816, as I said, and the question is that the Supreme Court really dealt with was the authority of the feds, the federal government, to basically to create this bank in order to do some certain things. They argued that they needed that bank to enforce the taxing power given to them by the Congress, and in order to do that, they said they needed it to store the government funds, they needed it to collect taxes, and they needed it to help regulate the value of money. All those things are granted specifically to them, to Congress, by the Constitution. So President James Madison got the bill on his desk from Congress, and he signed it into law. And then it was challenged by a few of the states in the country because they saw it as an encroachment of federal power on the state powers, on the state governments. So you have, again, this argument between the liberal constructionists and the strict constructionists, liberal constructionists being the federal government, and then who are trying to expand their powers, and then strict constructionists who are trying to limit the powers of that federal government and keep more powers for the states. So basically what happened is the Maryland state legislature, the state Congress, passed a law that taxed all banks that were chartered or basically created from outside of the state. And they were going to tax those banks $15,000 a year. And then the theory behind that was that it would drive them out of business, make them go bankrupt. So they did that to the federal bank, that national bank that was created by the federal government. James McCulloch, who the Supreme Court case is named after, he was simply the cashier, basically the head dude at the Baltimore branch of the National Bank, and he refused to pay it, saying we don't have to do that. We're the federal government. So there was this big argument. It goes on. The state of Maryland then sued McCulloch, and the state ruled in his favor. The original court that they went to ruled in his favor. He appealed. The Court of Appeals ruled, or not in his favor, in the state's favor in both cases. And he appealed, and then it went to the Court of Appeals. Also agreed that the state of Maryland had a good case, and then it went on to the Supreme Court. So in the Supreme Court, McCulloch and his attorney, they argued that the National Bank, and they used the necessary and proper clause, was a necessary and proper function of Congress, and that the state of Maryland didn't have the authority to tax the federal government. They simply said that they can't do that. The power to tax is the power to get rid of them, basically, is what they argued. So, and that it also interfered with the workings of the federal government. So the supremacy clause is also going to be another issue here. Okay, so the Supreme Court then eventually ends up ruling that the National Bank was a necessary and proper entity in order to collect taxes and borrow money for the federal government. So they did need it. And they also ruled that, and this is something that's big for the future from 1816, that the Constitution and the laws by the federal government could not be impeded, could not be interfered with by any state law. So any federal laws, and the Constitution says this pretty much straightforwardly, any federal law basically is supreme. It supersedes any state laws. So basically, McCulloch versus Maryland then upheld the supremacy clause and also expanded the powers, the implied powers, and said this necessary and proper clause is the real deal. It's not, the national government's power isn't just limited to what is in the Constitution, as the strict constructionists, Thomas Jefferson being one of them in this, argued. Basically, this was one of the first times, and the reason that the federal government was able to expand its power over time. So that's kind of the big thing here with this Supreme Court case, McCulloch versus Maryland, is that it expanded the power of the federal government, and it hasn't stopped since. Again, a discussion for another day and discussion for class. So hopefully we did some learning here today, and see you in class. Today, hopefully, sometimes I wonder, I don't know, if you got this far even. Probably not listening to me at this point, so I'm probably wasting my air, but a few things about, you should have learned what the necessary and proper clause is, where it's found in the Constitution, how our interpretation of the Constitution has created or has helped us decide how far the federal government's powers reach. Should also understand better the ideas of strict constructionism and liberal constructionism, and how that interpretation that each of us has of the Constitution helps us to decide how far the federal government can go. And we also learned about what the Supreme Court has to say about the necessary and proper clause by looking a little bit at McCulloch versus Maryland, Eminem, all that good stuff. I don't know. But anyway, so McCulloch versus Maryland, which basically allowed the federal government to expand their powers over time and prove that the federal government was supreme. Any law that they created was a supreme law and would supersede any state law. So I'm hoping you learned a little bit here. Hey, Jack.